In an astonishing move that caught even senior courtiers off guard, King Charles has signed a sealed order altering the future of the monarchy forever. Within minutes, news broke that the children of Meghan Markle, Archie and Lilibet were officially removed from the royal line of succession. What led to such a merciless decision? And why now, in the middle of a growing storm behind palace walls? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began not with a grand announcement or a formal press release, but with the eerie silence that followed the sudden lockdown of Clarence House just before dawn. Inside those walls, behind two sets of guarded doors, King Charles sat alone at his desk. In his hand, a black fountain pen bearing the Windsor crest. The document before him wasn't just ink and paper, it was a royal decree powerful enough to erase bloodlines. And at 5:58 a.m., he signed it. The timestamp was deliberate. 5 minutes before the leak. 5 minutes before the monarchy would send shockwaves across the globe. But those closest to the throne already sensed something was coming. For weeks, whispers had been circulating inside Buckingham talks of a breach, of growing concerns, of a final straw that had pushed the monarch beyond diplomacy. Royal protocol had been tested, and this time, it shattered. Behind the curtain of tradition, there had been private clashes, unrecorded meetings, and quiet panic. The trigger, according to high-level sources, was an undisclosed violation involving the Sussex Circle. Something, or someone, had crossed an invisible line, and the palace was no longer willing to look the other way. One of the last meetings before the order was signed was between Meghan Markle and King Charles himself. It was unannounced, quietly arranged, and behind closed doors, it lasted just under 20 minutes. What was said remains sealed in silence, but those who saw the king afterward said he emerged with a look they hadn't seen since the days following Queen Elizabeth's funeral grave, but resolved. That same evening, the king's legal team was summoned. Not tomorrow, not next week. That night, a flurry of calls, security briefings, lawyers entering through back entrances before sunrise, a crisis unfolding in real time, with one goal, to formalize the unimaginable. Inside Buckingham, the reactions were instant and chilling. Aides stopped mid-conversation. Staff stared at phones as the royal website removed Archie and Lilibet's names from the succession list. No press conference, no elaboration, just silence. Cold, calculated, and irreversible. Some cried, some quietly cheered. But no one knew how to speak about it, not publicly. Because what had just happened wasn't ceremonial, it was surgical. A clean removal. A message, sent without a single spoken word. The public, meanwhile, was left blind. No warning, no explanation. Until now. Because behind this royal act lies something far deeper than a single decision. A fire has been burning within the palace walls, stoked by secrets, betrayal, and fear. And the order Charles signed is only the beginning. But this ruthless decision wasn't made in isolation. Behind it lies a chain of betrayal, secrets, and fear that had been boiling for months. Weeks before the removal, a classified set of documents was pulled from Windsor's secured vault under direct orders from Princess Anne. Those files, known only to a select inner circle, are said to contain the true reason Charles had no choice but to erase Archie and Lilibet from the succession list. And what's inside points to a scandal far deeper than anyone suspected. Long before Charles ever lifted his pen, the foundations of the monarchy had begun to tremble. Deep inside Windsor Castle, in a chamber guarded by protocol and secrecy, lay a series of documents long thought irrelevant until now. Their title was deceptively simple, Operation Thorn, but the contents were anything but. Written decades ago and buried beneath years of ceremonial dust, Operation Thorn was designed as a last resort. A contingency plan, created in the aftermath of royal scandal, meant to be activated only under conditions that threatened the future of the crown itself. It wasn't intended for modern times, and yet Princess Anne had it unearthed, quietly, strategically, without alerting the public, and without even informing key members of the royal household. Her reason? Unconfirmed at first. But insiders later revealed that Anne had received an urgent intelligence brief, suggesting a severe breach of royal tradition had occurred linked not just to Meghan, but to her inner circle's activities abroad. It wasn't about media interviews or television deals. This was something else. Something that crossed the line from defiance into what some senior aides feared could destabilize the institution altogether. The documents, according to one royal archivist, were explosive. They didn't just point fingers, they outlined a scenario in which the line of succession could be legally purged, without parliamentary approval, if the reigning monarch invoked a clause buried deep in the royal prerogative, a clause that hadn't been activated in over a century. The shock wasn't just in what the documents allowed, but in the fact that Charles was now considering using them. It was a move so radical that even his most loyal advisors were split. But for Princess Anne, it was simple. The monarchy's future mattered more than anyone's personal grief. And when she placed the sealed folder on Charles's desk, she said only one sentence: "You'll know when it's time." That time came when Prince William was quietly summoned to review the contents. He left the room without a word. No statement, no questions, just a nod, and then silence. Those closest to him said they had never seen him look more conflicted, and yet he offered no resistance. Because even he, torn between blood and crown, understood what was at stake. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Harry and Meghan remained unaware, not because no one told them, but because no one was allowed to. The palace had locked down communication, a complete blackout. They were being watched not for security, but for timing, because once the order was signed, there could be no reversal. The plan had been activated, and the royal machine was already in motion. While secret documents laid the groundwork, the final decision came after a devastating confrontation, one that ended all negotiations instantly. It was supposed to be a reconciliation, a rare private meeting between King Charles and Meghan Markle, brokered by Catherine, Princess of Wales. But what unfolded behind locked doors left the monarch visibly shaken. Sources say voices were raised, tears were shed, and when the room went silent, Charles had made up his mind. Catherine had been the only one who still believed peace was possible. Even as tension escalated, she held out hope that a private, personal conversation could bridge the growing chasm between the Sussexes and the Crown. She had watched the cracks deepen in the family, seen the anguish behind William's silence, and feared the consequences of a final, unspoken severing. So, she stepped in quietly. No cameras, no press, no staff, just a discreet arrangement that brought Meghan back to London under a shroud of secrecy. The meeting wasn't scheduled in the royal diary. It wasn't even confirmed to senior aides until minutes before. But it happened. And when it did, every ounce of restraint that had held the family together shattered behind that door. Those who passed by the corridor reported, raised voices, muffled but tense. What began with pleasantries dissolved quickly into confrontation. Meghan, according to one insider, came in not to apologize or explain, but to demand. Her words were direct. She wanted assurance that her children would retain their titles. She sought clarity on their security, their presence on the royal website, and the recognition she felt they had been denied. But Charles didn't flinch. After everything, the interviews, the books, the headlines, he had reached his threshold. And when Meghan insisted her children deserved equal protection, equal recognition, the king stood, cold and final. "You've crossed the line," he told her. No explanation. No further discussion. What followed was chaos cloaked in royal silence. Meghan reportedly broke down in tears, overwhelmed not just by the rejection, but by the unyielding finality in Charles's tone. She stormed out, refusing to be escorted by the waiting security, her departure more symbolic than planned. It wasn't just an exit from a meeting. It was a resignation from any remaining illusion that a path back into the fold existed. But what she didn't realize was that this meeting was never about finding common ground. Charles had already made his decision. This was a courtesy, one last opportunity for understanding before the hammer fell. What's more chilling is that the king didn't go into that room unarmed. Camilla had already warned him. In hushed tones the night before, she made it clear Meghan would not come to reconcile, but to provoke. And if he wanted to protect the institution, he'd need to act decisively. "Don't let emotions cloud duty," she told him, and he listened. The security detail outside that room hadn't been summoned for protection. They were there in case the entire encounter went off script. Every angle had been considered, every outcome prepared for, and when the door finally opened and Charles stepped out, he said nothing. What began as a personal plea erupted into a royal rupture, and once Charles emerged from that room, a storm was set in motion. This wasn't just about Archie and Lilibet. It was about the bloodline, the crown, legacy, and lineage of a monarchy already stretched thin. With questions swirling about legitimacy, heritage, and loyalty, Charles faced pressure from every corner of the institution. And the deeper he looked into the future, the more urgent it became to sever the line. The British monarchy has always survived through the sanctity of its succession. Names etched into history by blood, birthright, and sacred ceremony. But in the twilight of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, Charles was left to reckon with a more fractured and complicated future. The traditional rules, clear, codified, and anchored in centuries of precedent, were no longer enough to insulate the crown from modern chaos. Behind palace walls, a silent but ferocious battle was being waged. On one side, royal succession laws. On the other, the sovereign's ancient prerogative. And caught in between was the dilemma of two children born into royalty, but raised in exile. The Lord Chamberlain argued caution, fearing backlash from constitutional scholars and Commonwealth partners. But the King's private secretary, less sentimental, more strategic, urged a clean break. His message was blunt. The longer their names remain, the weaker the institution becomes. It wasn't a matter of personal vendetta. It was structural. The dual nationality of the children, their absence from royal life, and their ambiguous titles all posed legal and symbolic threats. How could a monarchy rooted in lineage defend a line that no longer belonged to the crown's future? What made matters worse was the persistent uncertainty around their religious and territorial standing. Archie's baptism had sparked controversy, but Lilibet's birth was even more problematic. Born on American soil, with no traditional ceremony, no official blessing, no church record entered into the royal registry. For a family governed by heritage and ritual, this wasn't just unconventional, it was unrecognizable, and it raised the most dangerous question of all. Could the line of succession be infiltrated, even unintentionally, by bloodlines disconnected from the institution's values? And then came the murmurs from the Queen's former aide, a woman who had served Her Majesty for over 4 decades. In a closed-door conversation, she reportedly said, "The Queen would never have allowed this, not without a reckoning." Her words rippled through the corridors like a prophecy. They weren't a judgment on Meghan. They were a reflection of how far the monarchy had drifted from its traditional compass, and how desperately Charles needed to restore it before it fractured under the weight of ambiguity. But it wasn't just about titles, rituals, or even geography. It was fear. Fear that the monarchy, already stretched thin by generational divide and modern scrutiny, could collapse under the pressure of unresolved loyalties. The longer the question lingered whether Archie and Lilibet belonged within the royal future, the more perilous the institution's stability became. And so Charles did what he believed had to be done. He cut the line to save the crown. A decision made not with malice, but with chilling conviction. But while Charles acted for the crown, his own family was falling apart behind palace walls, and one voice rose above the rest in silent protest. William, Prince of Wales, remained silent when the announcement was made. No statement, no appearance, just a sudden, unexplained cancellation of all public engagements. But insiders reveal he was anything but calm, and his silence masked an explosive inner conflict that may forever change his relationship with his father. For a man raised under the weight of destiny, William knew the rules. Appear strong, speak rarely, and when you do, never reveal the fracture beneath the surface. But the morning his father made the decision to remove Archie and Lilibet from the royal line, something in him cracked. It wasn't visible to the world, but it was undeniable behind closed doors. The man who had once tried to balance tradition with compassion disappeared from public view entirely. All scheduled appearances were wiped clean, his team offering no comment, only whispers that he was unwell, resting, postponing for personal reasons. But those inside Kensington knew the truth. William wasn't hiding from the public. He was struggling with a storm that no title could protect him from. The confrontation came swiftly, and it wasn't cordial. Behind the gilded silence of royal halls, William went directly to Charles, not as the heir to the throne, but as a brother, a father, and a man unwilling to stay quiet. What was said during their exchange was never officially recorded, but sources say it was the most volatile moment between father and son since the days following Diana's death. William demanded to know why he hadn't been consulted, why there had been no discussion, why the children were punished for decisions they had no part in. Charles's answer, reportedly clinical, offered little comfort. "This is about preservation," he told William, "not preference." What tore at William wasn't politics, it was blood. As a father, he saw George, Charlotte, and Louis in Archie and Lilibet. As a brother, he remembered the boy he once protected from the media's harshest gaze. His instincts screamed to defend. But as the future king, his loyalty to the institution forced him to stay silent. He walked the razor's edge between personal agony and public restraint, a place he knew too well. Still, a single message slipped through. One private text sent to Harry after the announcement read simply, "This isn't what I wanted." No explanations, no apologies, just an acknowledgement that the pain stretched further than the press could ever print. Catherine, caught in the middle of it all, tried desperately to mediate. She had already failed to bring peace between Meghan and Charles. Now, she found herself trying to steady a husband who was unraveling. She knew William carried guilt. He had stayed loyal to the crown while Harry walked away, and now that loyalty had come at a cost neither of them could have imagined. But there was no reversing it. The order was done. The ink had dried. And so William wrestled with the war inside him. The crown demanded obedience. His heart demanded justice. He chose silence, but not because he agreed. He chose it because speaking would mean choosing between his father and his brother, and either choice would destroy him. And as the royal family fractured, Meghan and Harry were forced to confront their worst nightmare on live camera. They found out on camera. A leaked clip from an upcoming documentary reportedly shows Meghan's raw, unfiltered reaction the moment the royal website was updated, removing her children's names from the line of succession. What followed stunned even the crew. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The documentary, pitched as a reflection on healing, motherhood, and the journey beyond royalty, was carefully crafted. Meghan had let down her guard, inviting cameras into what was meant to be a moment of quiet strength. But what unfolded instead was a real-time collapse. At first, she was pacing, phone in hand, reading and rereading the screen as if hoping the words would disappear. Her voice cracked. The panic in her tone said more than any statement could. Then, silence, and beside her, Harry frozen, eyes locked on the same screen. His hands didn't move, his jaw clenched. And then, under his breath, one word. A curse, sharp and cold, breaking through the silence like glass. The camera crew stood still, instinctively waiting for the director to call cut. But no one spoke. Meghan's expression shifted from disbelief to devastation, her body folding into itself under the weight of what had just been taken from her. "They've taken everything," she said, again and again. Not as a performance, not for drama, but as if trying to convince herself that this wasn't a nightmare. The producer whispered to cut the feed. The lead cameraman hesitated. The footage kept rolling. Whether out of instinct, shock, or professional ruthlessness, the lens didn't blink, and in those few unrehearsed minutes, the world saw what royal decisions do not to politics, but to people. The footage wasn't supposed to leave the editing room, but like everything surrounding the Sussexes, it leaked, a rough cut, grainy, unscored, raw. Within hours, it was on the desks of media executives, royal reporters, and crisis PR firms. Panic exploded behind the scenes. Reputations were at risk. Sympathy could swing public opinion too far. Meghan's vulnerability, unscripted and unrehearsed, was a weapon neither side expected. The palace scrambled. Communications teams were briefed. Social media profiles were scrubbed. Legal warnings began circulating before the clip even went viral, but the damage was already done. What had been intended as a quiet administrative update had, instead, ignited a firestorm of grief, rage, and public spectacle. For Meghan, the aftermath wasn't just about the footage, it was about perception. She feared what this meant for her children, not just symbolically, but tangibly. Would they now be seen as outsiders? Were they targets? Had the final thread connecting them to the legacy of their great-grandmother been severed for good? Her fears weren't abstract. They were maternal, immediate. She had fought for visibility. Now, invisibility had been weaponized against her, but even as emotions boiled over, another player made her move, and she's been waiting in silence for years. While others mourned, one royal figure acted. Princess Anne, the ever-loyal enforcer of tradition, stepped into the void with precision. For years, she stayed in the background. Now, she's taking charge of the monarchy's future, and there's no turning back. When the crown finds itself at a crossroads, it rarely announces who takes the reins. But those who understand the institution know that true authority doesn't always come from the throne, it comes from the shadows that guard it. And in the weeks leading up to the official removal of Meghan's children from the royal line of succession, Princess Anne moved with quiet, deliberate force. She had watched the chaos unfold from the periphery long enough, the endless headlines, the family implosions, the erosion of royal protocol. It was everything her mother had spent a lifetime protecting, now dangling by a thread. And Anne, ever the soldier of duty, would not let that thread snap without intervention. It began with a briefing, days before Charles put pen to paper. A private session between brother and sister, shielded from the media, locked away from advisors. Anne came not to ask, but to instruct. She presented the situation not as an emotional betrayal, but as an operational crisis. There was no yelling, no tears, just a line drawn with steely precision. "We're done pretending." Those 4 words changed the tone of the entire discussion. Charles, wearied by scandal and torn between crown and kin, needed someone who wouldn't hesitate. And Anne had never been one to blink in the face of consequence. She didn't stop at the family circle. Days later, she met privately with top military figures and Commonwealth envoys, conversations held behind soundproofed doors, where the topic was not personal fallout, but structural stability. To Anne, this wasn't about Harry and Meghan. It was about the monarchy's survival. And with growing concern that the institution was bleeding credibility, she knew swift containment was the only viable option. She raised alarms about future succession ambiguity, dual allegiance complications, and the looming risk of an external legal challenge. Her goal was clear: reinforce the monarchy's lines before anyone outside could breach them. In the background, she forged a quiet alliance with one of the few royals still trusted on both sides, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Together, they orchestrated a maneuver to prevent any future appeals from the Sussexes through the Royal Council. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. A firewall, carefully constructed, to protect the sovereign's decision from being unraveled by emotion, protest, or public pressure. Anne's message was simple: emotion must never eclipse the monarchy's mission. And while many inside the family grieved the decision's human cost, Anne never flinched. She wasn't there to console. She was there to secure. The Queen's legacy, the Crown's continuity, the very framework of what it means to be royal, it all demanded a sacrifice. And Princess Anne, the unyielding executor of royal tradition, was willing to bear the weight that others couldn't. But behind all the stoic silence, a far more dangerous move was unfolding, one that could fracture the monarchy's legal foundation forever. Prince Harry isn't staying quiet. Within 24 hours of the announcement, legal teams representing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex began drafting what one insider called a constitutional counter-offensive. At stake, not just the succession, but the very limits of royal power. The palace had expected outrage. It had prepared for public sympathy, prepared for backlash, even braced itself for another round of interviews and headlines. But what it hadn't fully accounted for, at least not in this form, was a direct legal challenge aimed at the very foundation of the monarch's authority. Harry, furious and blindsided, moved swiftly, not with press releases or angry statements, but with lawyers. A flurry of confidential inquiries were submitted to the Royal Legal Council, demanding clarity on the constitutional basis for the removal of his children from the line of succession. It was no longer a family dispute, it was a battle over sovereign limits and whether tradition could survive modern law. The documents reportedly questioned whether the king's unilateral decision violated any parliamentary oversight mechanisms, even those rarely invoked. And beyond the UK, Meghan's legal team explored something far more explosive, the possibility of leveraging Lilibet's U.S. citizenship and birthplace. If challenged in an American court, they argued, the royal family could be forced into a cross-border legal quagmire, one that would drag titles, protocols, and personal correspondence into open scrutiny. They weren't just threatening embarrassment, they were threatening exposure of every hidden message, every private email, every conversation previously protected by palace privilege. Among the documents the Sussex camp prepared, one stood out: a draft timeline of private communications between Meghan and Charles. Messages that, according to their legal team, contained promises perhaps not legally binding, but morally devastating. These weren't idle threats. The mere suggestion of releasing such messages sent tremors through palace corridors. There was no way to contain the narrative once those texts saw the light of day, and for the Crown, discretion is not a preference, it's survival. The royal household now found itself cornered by the one scenario it had long feared, a monarch's private decision facing the possibility of public legal challenge. Royal precedent had never been tested under the scrutiny of 21st century international law, and no matter how carefully worded the sovereign's decree had been, the legal ambiguity surrounding succession in the modern world left room for a challenge. The monarchy, once seen as immune to judicial interference, was suddenly being asked to defend its most sacred powers, not before a loyal Privy Council, but potentially in front of foreign courts, international media, and a public no longer bound by reverence. Inside Buckingham, the mood shifted from quiet confidence to cold apprehension. Advisors whispered about contingency plans, possible settlements, and the nuclear option public compromise. But Charles, unbending, refused to entertain the idea. To him, this wasn't just about children, it was about command. If he gave in, even slightly, the illusion of absolute authority would be shattered for good. And so the Crown braced itself for a fight that could end not just a feud, but a legacy. And as the legal firestorm brews, King Charles retreats, but not to surrender. In a private chamber beneath Windsor Castle, King Charles met alone with the royal decree keeper. His command, lock the new line of succession into the Book of Sovereigns. The message was clear. There would be no reversal. The monarchy has spoken, and the crown now bears the scars of the decision. It was not a ceremony. There were no heralds, no horns, no pageantry. The act itself took less than 5 minutes, but the weight of what it meant would ripple across generations. King Charles, shoulders burdened with both duty and consequence, entered the chamber alone. The royal decree keeper, custodian of the monarchy's most sacred records, awaited his arrival with the great leather-bound Book of Sovereigns open and waiting. And without pause, the king gave the final instruction. The new line, official, irreversible, was entered. The names of Archie and Lilibet were gone, erased not only from ceremony, but from legacy. Behind the decision, the emotional toll began to show. Camilla, having watched her husband move through this storm with iron resolve, finally voiced her quiet concern. It wasn't the political backlash that worried her, it was him, his health, his solitude, his silence. In private, aides spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken grief, But Charles refused to waver. He believed the strength of the crown required sacrifice, even if that sacrifice cost him his family's trust. He wasn't acting as a father anymore. He was acting as a monarch. In the same breath that one legacy was cut, another was elevated. Prince George, young, quiet, and observant, was given a symbolic gesture that insiders say marked the beginning of his own royal apprenticeship. A small, deliberate moment between grandfather and grandson, a passing of something intangible. In that gesture, Charles hoped to secure a future that would be unquestionable, untarnished, and anchored fully in the institution's traditions. The monarchy needed a clean slate, and George was now its centre. Meanwhile, archivists worked discreetly but swiftly. Digital records were amended, titles removed, birth lines adjusted. A royal emergency update had been executed with clinical precision. Servers were recoded, protocols adjusted. The world would no longer see the names where they once had been. What was once public was now purged. Meghan's children, royal by blood, were no longer royal by record. The symbolic violence of that erasure struck harder than any tabloid headline could. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. But with every act of preservation came a new fracture. Behind every signature, a wound. The monarchy may have emerged more fortified, more orderly, but the family within it lay in pieces. Father against son, brother against brother. Children divided not by love, but by lineage. It was the price Charles was willing to pay, not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. And so, the line of succession moves forward, but not without ghosts. What price will the crown pay for clarity? And has the king truly secured the monarchy, or opened the gates to its downfall? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.